Cold War techno thriller. A very particular writing genre that I think demands an examination. In particular, the author Gary Allen Roos calls attention to this genre and his own story, A Game of Titans, as a definite entry in the genre. What I find peculiar is that this ends up reminding me, and likely other readers, of much more famous authors in the genre, like Tom Clancy or Dale Brown. I don't intend to belittle Roos's work when I say that calling out the writing genre brought to mind The Hunt for Red October much easier than what his own story brought to the table. Remember, my whole shtick is examining airships and their narrative importance in fiction, and Roos is one of the few authors I know of that ever attempted to make a genuine lighter-than-air rigid dirigible the center stage of a story such as this, where an American nuclear-powered airship races a Soviet nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to recover a scientist and his advanced technology as a MacGuffin in the backdrop of the American-Soviet Cold War. I want to take some time to examine the genre of the Cold War techno-thriller itself, because it could better explain some of the conventions of the writing that Roos uses and reveal themselves in story. The point is, depending on reader expectations and context, your mileage may vary on how much they uphold the story. The first most important tenet is the Cold War itself. After World War II, the nuanced differences between American and Soviet foreign policy brought out a competition for international influence between the two erstwhile superpowers. The most common and frankly oversimplified summary of the rivalry goes something like this. America and the Soviet Union, as well as their allied Europeans and their empires, brought down the Nazi regime in Germany, but left them with differing views of how the peace thereafter should be handled. Again, to oversimplify, America wanted Europe, Germany included, functional again after the destruction suffered in the war, and reconstituted in a way that would ensure they would not want to war in Europe again. Alas, the Soviet Union, and Stalin in particular, wanted Germany divided and weak, such that they would physically be unable to wage war again, given the barbarous brutality of Hitler's project to kill off all Russians and make new Lebensraum for proper Aryans. This led to two very different approaches in dividing Europe between the American project and the Soviets. Exemplary of these differing projects are the American-led Marshall Plan, which funded the reconstruction of cities and infrastructure across Europe, and the Soviet Plan, which I don't know if there is a particular name for it, but it included not only some reconstruction, but very particularly the dismantling and shipping of industry towards the Russian heartland for reconstruction purposes, and the sponsoring of communist political parties everywhere the Soviet military managed to occupy before war's end, regardless of their actual popularity. The differences between the American-led Western project and the Soviet project for post-war peace became even more stark, with the Berlin blockade and the responding Berlin airlift. For all the nuanced political or ideological reasons Stalin had, again, this is oversimplified, he had West Berlin, under American, British, and French occupation, cut off from the outside. The scarcity in food and fuel already experienced by German civilians would threaten to turn into a famine if something wasn't done. Between abandoning the Berliners to their fate, or starting a military confrontation that could escalate to another world war, before the Soviets even had a nuclear weapon, a truly amazing logistical feat was decided on, an air operation of cargo transports, for supplying Germans what they needed to survive the blockade. That's a whole story and drama unto itself, and many other creators and essayists have done it more justice than I ever could. So I'm just going to continue with the Berlin airlift succeeded in convincing Stalin to give up the Berlin blockade. And the stakes for the ideological future of world affairs was set even more starkly. As my perspective on the genre is mostly based on the Western perspective, stories of Cold War intrigue almost always involve the Soviet influence as an insidious, subversive, and frankly vague threat of communism. No matter the societal intrigues, international grandstanding, nor military ambitions, every threat that originates from Russia always comes with the overhanging threat of nuclear missile attack and mutually assured destruction. Take the portrayal of the Russians in story as an example. We, the readers, are introduced to the command crew of the Kiev while they're out on fleet maneuvers in the Pacific. But their sortie is interrupted by a new mission from the Kremlin to proceed to a lonely island in the South Pacific, contact a Soviet agent, and recover an advanced piece of technology and the errant Czechoslovakian scientist with it, all under the guise of a rescue operation for stranded survivors of a plane crash. Thus, they change course for the island and come up against the American effort to do the same. But there's a problem. The American vessel sent on the same course is faster and an unfamiliar element in the mission. They can reach the island first and complete their mission before the Soviets even have a chance to recover the prototype and scientist, much less portray their goodwill by providing medical relief to the crash survivors. Thus, they send aircraft to examine the American vessel, an airship, and subsequently fire on the vessel, disabling its propulsion so that the Kiev can make its way. Again, there's a problem, because the American airship refuses to behave like a good little gas bag and stay disabled, preferably foundered on the waves. It repairs itself and insolently continues to outpace the Kiev and make for the island. The Russian command crew cannot even consider shooting it down with the surface-to-air missiles because the Americans refuse to get within range. After a clear set of orders from the Kremlin, complete the mission and stop the airship, the admiral commanding the Kiev orders airplanes to take off and bring down the airship the hard way, potentially killing Americans. Yet again, the American airship refuses to cooperate by being defenseless, and even has the audacity to shoot down an attacking Soviet fighter, but still sparing the pilot. That pesky airship even launches its own fighters. The escalation in establishing air superiority and a connection to the island continues up to, but just short of landing troops to take everyone prisoner at gunpoint. Part of me is surprised that they didn't because of their written behavior and reasoning up to that point. At each turn from when the Russians first fire upon the airship Grand Eagle to deploying troops on the island, the representatives of American government constantly worry about escalation past the point of no return, where an American military response will somehow trigger the Kremlin to launch nuclear Armageddon. What is so jarring to me is that the Russian characters themselves seem to have no concern about the Americans escalating in response to Russian attacks on their vessel, the airship Grand Eagle, and the threat of ground troops against civilians on the island. The way Gary Allen Roos portrays the Russians, it appears they have an almost myopic or suicidal lack of awareness that their attacks might give cause to the Americans to retaliate in a way they cannot handle. The most we hear from their point of view is their curiosity as to why, after attacking Grand Eagle the first time, more American warships haven't been sent in response, nor any missiles sent to attack. They conclude that this somehow means the Americans are not in a strong position to respond. They never consider that the American airship is considered strong enough on its own, and what that would entail. Neither do they consider that the American officials, who we hear conversing in story, are fully capable of retaliating against the Russian effort in general, and the Soviet carrier Kiev in particular. The Russians never even learned that the Grand Eagle could sink the Kiev outright with onboard anti-ship missiles, if the Americans were as single-mindedly concerned with strength as the Russians were. So why would Roos write the Russians with this kind of character, and how would it serve the story? This is why I want to examine the context of the Cold War in Cold War fiction. It's the most fundamental thread of any Cold War story, techno-thriller or not, even for Rus's A Game of Titans, where any escalation in hostile action is considered a slippery slope to nuclear Armageddon. To me, it always begged the question, why would a national government want to threaten nuclear war for want of indulgence of one kind or another? The easy answer is also the most propagandist, that the Soviet Union would stop at nothing to spread the communist revolution, and through all means necessary, even if it means losing friends, making enemies, and ending the world. To face and respond to Soviet threat meant a battle for existential survival and not mere power politics. The hang-up is that all this assumes the Soviet leadership would be willing to take risks to the point of being suicidal, and it's hard to believe that absolutely everyone in a power structure would be suicidal in their project of spreading an ideology, or else how would they manage to accomplish anything else needed to hold power? There's a good reason that assuming the Kremlin wants to dominate the world is an easy premise for a Cold War thriller. Finding out the real reasons behind Soviet and Russian attitudes towards nationhood, governance, and international relations takes a great deal of work and research to even begin to understand. Fortunately, I came across at least 2 documents that portray how America and the West were trying to understand and respond to the Soviet and Russian disposition. This will be an extensive aside, but it helps give context to the writing conventions present in Cold War thriller fiction writing. Examinations include the reports of a certain George F. Kennan, an American diplomat stationed in Russia after World War II and later historian, and a further report from his successor, Paul H. Nietzsche, a businessman turned director of policy planning at the U.S. Department of State. Their respective documents are the Long Telegram and NSC 68. These were 2 very different men with 2 very different attitudes concerning the Russians, and their observations, recommendations, and others' actions based thereon shaped the Cold War as we know it. After World War II was finished, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was giving a speech to members of his government in February 1946 to justify his refusal to have the Soviet Union sign on with international organizations such as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. And George Kennan was there to observe on behalf of and answer questions for the American State Department. After his time spent in the Soviet Union, George Kennan summarized his findings and recommendations in a document called the X Article, officially known as The Sources of Soviet Conduct, and unofficially as the Long Telegram. Trying to paraphrase and summarize his words would frankly be a waste of his insight, so I'll read out an excerpt here. The USSR still lives in an antagonistic, capitalist encirclement worldview, with which in the long run there can be no permanent peaceful coexistence. That internal conflicts of capitalism inevitably generate wars, especially wars of intervention against the socialist world. But intervention against the USSR must be forestalled at all costs, and the USSR must remain militarily powerful, ideologically monolithic, and faithful to its present brilliant leadership. This party line does not represent natural outlook of Russian people. They are, by and large, friendly to the outside world, eager for experience of it, eager to measure against its talents they are conscious of possessing, and eager above all to live in peace and enjoy fruits of their own labor. The party line only represents thesis which official propaganda machine puts forward with great skill and persistence to a public often remarkably resistant in the stronghold of its innermost thought. But party line is binding for outlook and conduct of people who make up the apparatus of power, party, secret police, and government, and it is exclusively with these that we have to deal. Soviet party line is not based on any objective analysis of situation beyond Russia's borders, that it has indeed little to do with conditions outside of Russia. That is, arises mainly from basic inner Russian necessities which existed before recent war. At the bottom of Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Originally, this was insecurity of a peaceful agricultural people trying to live on a vast exposed plain in neighborhood of fierce nomadic peoples. To this was added, as Russia came into contact with economically advanced West, fear of more competent, more powerful, more highly organized societies. But this type of insecurity afflicted Russian rulers rather than Russian people. For Russian rulers have invariably sensed that their rule was relatively archaic in form, fragile and artificial in its psychological foundation, and unable to stand comparison or contact with political systems of Western countries. For this reason, they have always feared foreign penetration, feared direct contact between Western world and their own, feared what would happen if Russians learned the truth about the world without, or if foreigners learned truth about the world within. And they have learned to seek security only in patient but deadly struggle for total destruction of rival power, never in compacts and compromises with it. It is no coincidence that Marxism, rendered even more truculent and intolerant by Lenin's interpretation, became a perfect vehicle for the sense of insecurity with which Bolsheviks were afflicted. In this dogma they found justification for their instinctive fear of the outside world, for the dictatorship without which they did not know how to rule, for cruelties they did not dare not to inflict, and for sacrifice they felt bound to demand. In the name of Marxism, they sacrificed every single ethical value in their methods and tactics. Without it, they would stand before history, at best, as the latest of that long succession of cruel and wasteful Russian rulers who have relentlessly forced the country onto ever new heights of military power to guarantee external security of their internally weak regimes. This thesis provides justification for that increase of military and police power of the Russian state, for that isolation of the Russian population from the outside world, and for that fluid and constant pressure to extend limits of Russian police power, which are together the natural and instinctive urges of Russian rulers. Now I can confidently summarize George Kennan's view of the Soviet-Russian worldview. Without propaganda, the Russian people can be treated as equal to others in their dignity and potential. But Russian leadership, based on a geographic and cultural determinism, keep telling their people the outside world is bad and a threat. We are great, but we must sacrifice everything we can for military power to survive outside threat and become supreme world leaders, all in order to uphold their hollow and shallow claim to power. Kennan's solution to dealing with the Soviet Union and Russia, in this view, was to contain its influence, by showing on the international stage that the Soviet and Russian system of governance fell short of its promises. The end goal of this containment would be to negotiate a peaceful coexistence between communist countries and the rest of the world, contrary to the assumptions of Russian leadership. I recommend reading the whole of Kennan's long telegram. I think it explains so much about what we see and discover about real Russian actions and why they are so. Alas, Kennan's assessment and recommendations were not fully utilized when a later policymaker, Paul Nietzsche, formulated his own in the document NSC 68. Nietzsche had very different assumptions and conclusions concerning the Russian disposition. The fundamental design of those who control the Soviet Union and the international communist movement is to retain and solidify their absolute power, first in the Soviet Union and second in the areas now under their control. In the minds of the Soviet leaders, however, achievement of this design requires the dynamic extension of their authority and the ultimate elimination of any effective opposition to their authority. The design, therefore, calls for the complete subversion or forcible destruction of government and structure of society in the countries of the non-Soviet world, and their replacement by those subservient to and controlled from the Kremlin. The United States, as the principal center of power in the non-Soviet world and the bulwark of opposition to Soviet expansion, is the principal enemy who must be subverted or destroyed by one means or another if the Kremlin is to achieve its fundamental design. The same compulsion which demands total power over all men within the Soviet state, without a single exception, demands total power over all communist parties and all states under Soviet domination. Stalin has said that the theory and tactics of Leninism, as expounded by the Bolshevik Party, are mandatory for the proletarian parties of all countries. Thus, unwillingly, our free society finds itself mortally challenged by the Soviet system. No other value system is so wholly irreconcilable with ours, so implacable in its purpose to destroy ours, so capable of turning to its own uses the most dangerous and divisive trends in our own society. No other so skillfully and powerfully evokes the elements of irrationality in human nature everywhere, and no other has the support of a great and growing center of military power. The Kremlin uses Soviet military power to back up and serve the Kremlin design. It does not hesitate to use military force aggressively if that course is expedient in the achievement of its design. The Kremlin's design for world domination begins at home. The first concern of a despotic oligarchy is that the local base of its power and authority be secure. Being a totalitarian dictatorship, the Kremlin's objectives is the total subjective submission of the people now under its control. The Kremlin's policy toward areas not under its control is the elimination of resistance to its will and the extension of its influence and control. It is driven to follow this policy because it cannot tolerate the existence of free societies. To the Kremlin, the most mild and inoffensive free society is an affront, a challenge, and a subversive influence. The means employed by the Kremlin in pursuit of this policy are limited only by considerations of expediency. Doctrine is not a limiting factor, rather it dictates the employment of violence, subversion, and deceit, and rejects moral considerations. The Kremlin is inescapably militant because it possesses and is possessed by a worldwide revolutionary movement, because it is the inheritor of Russian imperialism, and because it is a totalitarian dictatorship. You can probably tell where most of our popular portrayals of Soviet or Russian power comes from. From Nietzsche's point of view, in summary, the Russian-Soviet state applies total power over its people to make them accept the Kremlin as the center of all communist and socialist authority, extends this power to control all communist and socialist movements in the world as a monolith, and sees unfettered military force as an acceptable means to world domination. As from later quotes in the same article, morality is what serves the revolution, and there's no way to make the United States inoffensive to the Kremlin except by complete submission to its will. For a variety of assumptions and reasons spelled out in NSC 68, policies were drafted and implemented into what we would now call containment, but of a military kind, where a buildup of armed forces and alliances worldwide would essentially try to make the Kremlin project to expand influence as risky and costly as possible. The American involvement in Vietnam to contain communism comes to mind. From the historical perspective, I expect neither Kennan's nor Fitz's assumptions and conclusions were completely correct or incorrect. It seems to me their views are like two sides of the same coin. In any case, they're worthwhile reads on their own merits. How their viewpoints relate to the Russian characters in Gary Allen Roos's novel is that the Russians in story seem to resort to military force very easily, at least on the local level of naval units, seemingly unrestrained by top-down control, which is frankly counter my view of Russians as totally dependent on centralized command, and assured that they can do no wrong, much less bring the Soviet Union into a conflict they don't want and aren't ready for. However, when the American president makes contact with the Soviet Party leader, the leader is indignant that a Soviet citizen was endangered in battle, never mind that they were part of an explicitly aggressive Soviet attack on an American vessel. It's the kind of neurotic response an insecure leader might emphasize when an operation isn't going their way. As a thought experiment, let's say the American response to the Russians was different. Instead of acting purely defensively, what if, say, the airship or other naval vessels confronted the Russians, or a missile was fired against the carrier? Maybe the Russians, seeing a promised and explicit cost to their aggression, might decide to back down. That is what containment via military means would hope to achieve. But what if they didn't? The American president and advisors in story considered how the Russians might decide to escalate the potential conflict in response to even defensive acts by the airship, much less offensive acts. Soviet vessels deployed in numbers to support the Kyiv, or an attack elsewhere in retaliation, for example. This assumes that the Russians in story would be more keen to attack, regardless of advantage or disadvantage, and not to withdraw and re-examine their disposition with new information. Basically, following the in-story Americans' assumptions, Gary Roos's Russians would be do-or-die, glory to the revolution types. The thing is, that doesn't completely fit all their actions and dispositions. Even with fighter aircraft on both sides, trying to outmaneuver and outposition each other, only the drones get into destructive fights. Gary Allen Roos writes the pilots in their aircraft as perfectly willing to preserve their own lives, even at the cost of a chance to touch down on their goal, rather than fight to the death. In addition, the implicit unspoken agreement, for lack of a better term, between the American president and the Soviet premier was that any conflict arising from the race to Tonga should be restricted to just the two vessels, airship Grand Eagle and carrier Kyiv. This implies that despite the American fear of Russian escalation, the Russians and especially the leadership may already have decided on how far to go in upholding the mission. From the Russian leadership point of view, they expected a package to be delivered to their agent in Tahiti, but it ended up in Tonga. No matter, as long as no one is the wiser, they can send a lone vessel to retrieve the package, and earn international goodwill in helping the crash survivors. They probably expected there were no American vessels in the area to take exception to their presence, so long as they stayed in international waters. But the wrinkle in the improvised plan is the emergence of an American airship that emerges from outside the context of the problem and didn't need to be pre-positioned in the area to interfere. It just speeds in and threatens the mission. With no other Soviet support in the area, and there very well wasn't, the Soviet leadership has a dilemma. They can recall the carrier to rejoin its fleet protection and give up the mission, ceding whatever technological advantage there is to be gained to the Americans. Or they can press the carrier forward to complete the mission and try to send support that might not arrive in time to strengthen their position. Or they can press the carrier forward and have the mission be left entirely to the carrier's capabilities. This part of the thought experiment has to assume that the Soviet leadership wants to avoid embarrassment more than secure a MacGuffin of technology, or even to lose a carrier, and that the Soviet leaders assume the same disposition of the American leadership. Since the Americans and no one else has exposed the true purpose of reaching the crash site, and there's no other presence in that part of the Pacific to monitor their actions, restricting military response to just the Kyiv can lead to certain outcomes. If the carrier secures the package, that's the optimum outcome. If the airship is damaged or downed in the process, no matter. Since the Americans did not yet reveal its presence to the public and world, it could be written off as an accident of an experimental craft, or covered up completely for the sake of secrecy and to avoid embarrassment. However, if the carrier fails its mission, then only the command crew needs to be reprimanded for their failure, and no one else in the Soviet Union need be the wiser for it. And if the carrier is sunk, it would be much safer to pin responsibility for the loss on the crew's incompetence or an accident, After all, in the Soviet Union, accidents and military failures are covered up all the time. There's no need to answer to anyone beyond the leadership, much less the people. And if at any point knowledge of the action got out and threatened the credibility of the Russian leadership, it would always be easier to blame the crew as going rogue. I hypothesize that, in story, the Soviet leadership was caught in a position of weakness, sending an aircraft carrier by itself where they mistakenly thought it wouldn't be under threat. Even with the cultural tendency to filter unfavorable information of the outside world to the leadership, not even the party could pretend that the carrier can extricate itself from a position where it was overmatched. Never mind that they likely never discovered the anti-ship weapons of the airship itself. Despite the Soviet leaders posturing that it would be dangerous to endanger the life of a Soviet citizen, I wouldn't be surprised if the crew themselves were left with the blame, or left to their fate, if the Americans really decided to unleash hell. As the end of the story goes, the Kyiv has lost out completely on securing the technology or the Czech scientist, and as the Grand Eagle withdraws back to the United States, the Kyiv cannot do anything to rescue their defeat, much less attack. We can fully expect that despite the zeal with which the Russian Rear Admiral and Captain executed the mission, the political officer Grigorovich, the party representative, will be less than charitable when speaking of their conduct and performance. I expect the best outcome would be that the former admiral, captain, and KGB agent would be forcibly retired early, sans benefits. If this story took place in Stalinist times, they'd probably be shot. In Cold War fiction, the tendencies of the Russian military to attack without concern for escalation, and the tendencies of the Russian leadership to have a neurotic fear for their credibility when the heroes inevitably thwart their plans, if I remember correctly, it leads to another trope of Cold War thriller fiction, especially for during or after the end of said Cold War. The trope where the Soviet or Russian military leadership goes rogue and overthrows the political leadership, so they can continue the Cold War, or go further and start the conquest of the world. It fits the view of Fitze from NSC 68, where the primary Russian method of international relations is military coercion and socio-political subversion, and Kennan's view from the sources of Soviet conduct that Soviet and Russian culture demands external military conquest to uphold a fragile internal stability. In the case where external conquest is impossible, it makes sense that the military power thus subverted without would turn within, and try for violent revolution and regime change. And in a story like Gary Allen Roos's A Game of Titans, where the military mission to recover a MacGuffin fails, either the military leadership or the political leadership must take the fall. Either the military leadership takes the fall and sows the seeds of resentment, or the political leadership takes the fall and the Soviet-Russian state suffers a crisis of credibility. If you want revolutions, that's how you get revolutions. Thus, a major part of Cold War thriller fiction is not simply that the Ruskies are the bad guys, and that they're damn dirty, cowardly bad guys at that. It's also that reading between the lines and taking the historical context into consideration reveals an outward coercion and aggression meant to conceal and uphold a fragile internal state. Which brings us to the other side of the coin for Cold War thrillers, the American side. Don't worry, this is a deeper discussion than the Americans simply being the designated good guys to be taken for granted. After all, the most basic human aspect of the story is that a plane crash strands a man fleeing an empire to find freedom, but they may not survive to get there. That man is taken under a medical care of a doctor on a remote island, and the only hope that man has is that the doctor's ex-boyfriend, who is being flown in via military assets, can arrive in time and stabilize his condition, that he might survive. The U.S. Air Force and its airship Grand Eagle are first and foremost the means to get there in time, and hopefully unmolested by damn dirty commies. So what does the American Air Force, and by extension the airship Grand Eagle, add to the story? It may very well not be a proper Cold War techno-thriller story without American involvement, especially if an American audience is being courted. But there's more to it than that. If the scientist fleeing to freedom had come from almost anywhere else, there'd be very little at stake in trying to save his life and bring him back to civilization. But he didn't come from just anywhere. He came from behind the Iron Curtain. The Czech scientist escaped from the tightly controlled, near inaccessible territory of the Empire of the Soviet Union. This means that recovering him, and especially his technical work, cannot be taken as simply a humanitarian effort, but a tangibly political mission. One of many that occurred between America and the Soviet Union in their Cold War. If anyone other than the American military and government establishment tried to recover the scientist, it would take very little coercive persuasion by the totalitarian USSR to have him returned to his rightful place. Only the Americans can be a credible deterrent to Soviet persuasion in this kind of fiction. The ways as to how they do this is what makes the Americans a crucial half and counterpart to the Soviet physical threat in Cold War techno-thriller fiction. It suffices to say that the American military effort to take Dr. Brandon to the remote island is more than just an expensive glorified taxi service. It is also a service that's faster than any waterbound ship, certainly any ship that could be outfitted to treat crash casualties. And it has the capacity to host a surgical operation room that could not be fitted to a conventional air transport aircraft, at least not at the time. This would be crucial to saving the scientist's life. Moreover, the remoteness and undeveloped nature of the island destination precludes the use of heavy air transports or even properly outfitted naval vessels for the task, so the mission truly calls for a flying ship that wouldn't rely on a fully prepared dock to touch down. It's all the excuse the story needs to depict an airship in all its glory as a fully operational military vessel. Even if the mission could be accomplished with more conventional transport, it still wouldn't be enough, because there's a fully armed and operational Soviet warship out to reach the island as well. Given a proper landing field and a large enough jet transport, the Americans could probably get by without being intercepted by the Kiev's VTOL fighters. But anything on the water would be hard-pressed to outrun the Kiev itself, or deter its jet fighters from attack. Assuming the nuclear power plant was reliable, running down a conventionally powered ship on the water would be a viable tactic for the Kiev, and if it wasn't, sending out jets to attack and helicopters to board would be the most basic options with which to subvert an American effort. But a fast airship literally gets around the Kiev faster. It has to exclusively resort to attacking with its VTOL fighters to slow it down, and it still doesn't succeed in the end. But there's more to this than an American military transport that can fend off an attack by dirty commies. It does at least 3 things for the characters, and us the readers, that wouldn't be so easy to do by other means, and not be immersion-breaking. There's a good reason much of the character dialogue takes place on the command deck. It's the one place with lines of communication to the island and the humanitarian crisis, not to mention imposter intrigue, unfolding, as well as a connection to the executive authority in Washington. From the airship's command deck, centrally placed in story, developments in the threads of plot can be kept track of by the characters, which is to say there's very little dramatic irony in this Cold War thriller. The wonder of consistent long-range communication to uphold a mission is a good part of the techno in techno-thriller writing. Another part is getting a good, consistent view of the action when the participants in the race inevitably come to blows. Frequently referenced and used throughout Grand Eagle's aerial escapades are the multiple cameras, radars, and sensors looking out into the sky surrounding the airship and projecting what they see on monitors on the command deck. When the Kiev sends aircraft against the airship or the island, the Grand Eagle never fails to detect them, and the characters never fail to grasp the gravity of their situation. Again, the technology to dispel the fog of war puts the techno in techno thriller. The final component that makes the American presence relevant in this techno thriller is the power and control granted to the airship to vanquish enemies and keep the moral high ground. The USAF Grand Eagle is armed with missiles and guidance systems such that instead of relying on destroying enemy planes and killing enemy aircrew, the airship can just target the fired enemy missiles and destroy those, neutralizing the threat and rendering the enemy effort impotent. Up to a point. When the Soviet pilots finally threaten the airship in a way that it can't easily defend itself, only then the decision is made to unleash the airborne laser weapons on the enemy fighters. For the unlucky Russian they caught, not only did the Americans have the power to destroy the plane, they had the control to deliberately spare the pilot a fiery death, using technology to try and send a message to the Soviets. We are stronger than you, and we choose mercy. Yet another technological wonder for the techno thriller. It's a shame that the Russian characters, if they were written as real people capable of self-reflection, never seem to appreciate just how much they get by on the sufferance of American mercy. Without the advanced technology on display, the American characters would really have to resort to killing Russians just to survive, let alone complete the mission. The advanced weapons would have made this even easier as written in story, and yet they still choose mercy. In this framework, I sense a great deal of inspiration from a piece of science fiction that was premiered just a few years before the time this book was published. For any fans of Star Trek listening in, you might recognize a certain quote from a very particular fictional starship captain. War is instinctive, but the instinct can be fought. We're human beings with the blood of 1,000,000 savage years on our hands. But we can stop it. We can admit that we're killers, but we're not going to kill. Today. That's all it takes. Knowing that we're not going to kill. Today. I wouldn't be surprised if Gary Allen Roos drew inspiration from Star Trek for how to equip his American airship crew in story. A more cynical writing of this story could easily have the Americans unleashing missiles and lasers to completely destroy the Soviet warship, their aircraft, and their infantry as well. Not only would this be a complete rejection of moral authority in story, it would neatly line up with the Soviet philosophy of military power. In that case, how would anyone be worth rooting for?